So now we turn to our keynote speaker, Paulo Guedes, the Brazilian Minister of Economy.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Well, half a day, exactly 12 noon. So we had an agenda of structural reforms. We were moving reasonably well in the first year. We made the Social Security reform. We broke the explosive dynamics of public spending. This was the expenditure that was really getting out of control, what privileges of Social Security. So we made this reform. Second move we made was to knock down expenditures on interest rates, interest payments. Usually they consider we cannot do much about that because we have the central bank targeting interest rates, and then you have a legacy of the past, an inheritance of the past, which is the stock, the size of the debt. But I don't accept that coming from the private sector. I know that you can do things like balance sheet repair. So our idea was exactly to deleverage public banks. We did it. They sent us like 130, 140 billion in the very first year. We sold another 150 billion in subsidiaries, state companies that could be privatized. This gave us tax on capital gains, gave us also an additional miles on that. And as a final result, we knocked down the debt GDP ratio in the very first year. It came from 76.4 to 75.4. So for the very first year, we put down first social expenditures, social security expenditures. Second, we changed also the future trajectory of interest rates because we went for a balance sheet repair program with the union. And the third one, wage bills. They have been raising immensely in the last 17, 18 years. They went 50% beyond inflation. So our government was the first one that has frozen expenditures with the wage bill for 3 years in a row. In 2015, we lost 1.5 million formal jobs. In 2016, we lost 1,380,000 formal jobs. And in 2020, we generated 140,000 new jobs. At the same time, with our job preservation programs, we have 45 million employees in the formal job market. 12 million are public employees, public officers. And 33 million are private sector formal jobs market. So out of the 33 million, we created a grants, a program of wage supplementation. So we allowed them to have flexible labor journeys. We allowed private companies to reduce up to a half their wages, and we would pay part of that reduction. And we preserved 11 million jobs. We have the identities, the IDs of each one of these employees that would be fired, and they called us, and we paid them. We compensated the company for the wage reduction program. It was a very successful program. We're renewing that now, and it saved us. It preserved 11 million jobs in the formal market, and that's the main reason why, as compared with recessions we had before, instead of destroying 1.5 million jobs, we created at the margin 140,000. And also these 64 million Brazilians digitalized, almost half of them in social assistance programs, the other half, what we call the invisible ones, the 38 million guys that belong to the informal market in Brazil. So the labor legislation is so obsolete that basically for 40 million people that work in the formal market, we have another 40 million in the informal market, and then 20 million in the social assistance programs. And then you have around 106 million of active labor force in Brazil. So we have digitalized all these invisible ones, and we assisted them first with around $120 monthly payments, grants, auxiliary grants, emergency grants. Then we reduced to half, and now it was 600 reales, then 300 reales last year, and then this year now we are renewing at 250 reales. So we are phasing out slowly all these layers of protection for the invisible guys in the informal market. Well, when we were really coming back strong, because the economy bounced back strongly in V-shaped recovery, and January and February were very interesting months because we removed these layers of protection for 2 months, and we had record taxes. We had record of creation of job creations in the formal market. We created 260,000 jobs in January. Usually, January is a very weak month because sales in Christmas, end of the season, people hire additional workers and they are fired, laid off at the beginning of the year. Instead, we generated 260,000 new jobs in January. And in February, a short month, we created 400,000 new jobs. So with mass vaccination, we probably will have a safe return to job creation. And Brazil was probably the only country in the world that during the pandemics is really implementing structural reforms. We are back to our structural reforms agenda. And the past few weeks, we approved the independent central bank to guarantee that the sector transitory price increases do not become generalized price increase. So we approved the independent central bank. It's a proper window of opportunity. We launched it and successfully approved in the Congress. Second, we approved our new fiscal framework, where we have now targets. When certain fiscal targets of excess spending are reached, immediately we trigger freezing of certain expenditures, like, for instance, public officers' wages. And you know, if you freeze the most important component of public expenditures for 1 year and a half, since the economy will grow 3.5%, 4%, inflation is around 3.5%, 4%, revenues will go up 8% 1 year, 8% second year. So the job is done. No fiscal crisis should last more than 1 year and a half if the triggers are, if the targets, fiscal targets are triggered and expenditures are frozen.
Suddenly, this year you had, as you mentioned, a number of reform efforts go through Congress. And, there are questions about the budget, but how do you explain that sort of sudden change? It's not an election year, or, what is your perception of Congress, especially the two new leaders?
Okay, on the budget, the thing is, we were building the budget for the very first time together with the Congress. It was always a very difficult problem because the budget, what we call amendments, the amendments that the congressman could have, they were really, in the past, recent past, they were really cuts out of the budget so that you could oppose the government. So you would take a piece of the cake, we called it impositive amendments, so that you went there, you get your share on the pie, and then you don't care about the government. So usually this mechanism was so that you could use part of the budget out of any political coalition. This time, ironically, it was the other way around. It was, how can we put together our amendments, our impositive amendments, how can we share this thing in the government programs? How can we fit? I just said two words, well, two short sentences, one with one word. I said first, is inexorable, I cannot execute it the way it is. It's too big because the political agreements must fit in the budget. So we cannot agree politically if there's more than we can afford to give in a political connection. All Republican, all pretty much happens in the US, in Germany, everywhere, which is how can we, together with the government, approve a budget? It's much more a sharing. It's a team that has never played together, and then let's say we now made some mistakes, and now the thing is much more a political thing of saying, well, how can we correct that together? Then properly we are fighting. We are not fighting. We are partners. We are independent powers, but can cooperate in the budget. And there is a problem now on how to correct the excessive spending that was sent at the first moment. With respect to the agenda, the structural reforms and agenda, well, it's moving very well in the first weeks of this. As soon as the election of the lower house and the Senate was finished, immediately six very important, like I said, reforms were implemented. Privatization of the postal service and Electrobras, the largest Latin American electric company in the electric sector. At the same time, independence of central bank, new fiscal framework, breaking of the monopoly of natural gas, and sanitation. So it's a very impressive record as the disease is backlashing on us in the midst of chaos, in the sense that it was a very this new breed of the disease is very severe. Um it was very impressive that the Congress worked these six important reforms, and they are giving us support now to reenact some of the most successful programs of last year. So the auxiliary grants are already in place. They began being delivered this week. And also the successful wage reduction supplementation program, which is this one that guaranteed 11 million jobs. We want to keep promoting this job preservation program. So we are relatively optimistic about the way Brazilian democracy, against all criticism, against all skepticism, how Brazilian democracy is behaving. In the first year with the Social Security reform, very impressive when you saw millions of people in other countries like France against the reform. In Brazil, people went to the streets in favor of the reform. In the second year, we also had an impressive response, our democracy, with all the noise. There's a lot of noise. The people say bad things about the country, democracy in the country, bad image abroad. But the fact is that GDP in Brazil dropped less than Germany, Italy, France, UK. UK dropped more than 9%, France more than 8%, Germany more than 5%, Japan 4.5%, and Brazil GDP dropped 4.1% without losses in the formal job market. So I think Brazilian democracy is really behaving properly.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think in the introduction I mentioned, and you talked about it as well, the spending ceiling is forcing Congress to make trade-offs. And you're trying to partner with them to give them different scenarios, and that's quite encouraging. We have a lot of questions, but hopefully I'll be able to send you emails because we're running out. We're almost out of time. Just one quick question about the exchange rate and inflation. I know something that I sort of talk about quite a bit is that a higher dollar helps the Brazilian government quite a bit, at least with their fiscal accounts. But could you give just a quick view on where, the exchange rate, trade, and the inflation rate at this point, and especially as it figures into the budget?
Inflation really picked up because the commodities went higher at the very same moment in which all our emergency grants were given to the most vulnerable ones. So these guys and everybody buying more food exactly when commodities went higher. The other side, which is the monetary side, the independent central bank, this is already in a tightening cycle. It began. It began even a little ahead of what expectations were, and I think with this, we'll should make inflation subside. In a few months ahead, I think it will subside, and we'll still be moving in our inflation targets intervals. With respect to the exchange rate, we were very conscious that we changed the policy mix. Not only we changed the flow, which is instead of a loose fiscal policy, which was a 40 years story in Brazil in terms of controlling public expenditures. Some governments raised the tax and reduced effectively the deficit. And we also, in our very first year, we put the deficit, which was at 2% of GDP, we put them at 1% of GDP. But controlling expenditures, never raising taxes, never raising taxes. So this is what we'll do. We will not raise taxes. It would not be wise to raise taxes in the midst of a recession. It doesn't make sense. So I don't know what is the structural deficit. Suppose, as we got here, it was 2%, the primary deficit. In the first year, it dropped to 1%. But Brazil is growing 1% or going down, 3.5% down in 2015, 3.5% down in 2016, 1% up 3 years in a row, then 4% down. Well, what if Brazil grows 3.5% this year and the structural deficit is, as a matter of fact, a structural surplus of 1.5%? Maybe this is what it will happen. So we'll not raise taxes. We'll resume growth. The great challenge this year is to transform a cyclical recovery based on consumption. We have to make it an investment-based sustainable growth phenomenon. We are willing to use privatizations, to accelerate privatizations, to reduce. We will knock down again the debt GDP ratio. We knock it down in the first year. Second year, it jumped up because of the pandemics. Third year now, we'll put it down again, the debt GDP ratio. So with balance sheet repair and with a tight fiscal, easier money combination, the equilibrium interest rates, the equilibrium exchange rate is higher. So it is higher. It is not 180 like we saw in the past. We used to have two-digit interest rates and 180 to 220 exchange rate. It's the other way around now. It's solid single-digit interest rates because we are tight on fiscal and we'll deleverage public banks and sell public properties to reduce and knock it down the debt GDP ratio in one side. And in the other side, the exchange rate is higher. So probably it should be around 4.5 by now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paulo. You extended over the time and been very, very generous with us on this thing. So the very best of luck to you and keep up the very hard and good work that you're doing.